I asked the barista if my coffee had an attitude, and somehow I became the person holding up the line, which is interesting because the line was already standing there before I arrived. Let me start by saying I like coffee shops. I like the smell. I like the warm lighting. I like the little chalkboard menus with words like single origin written as if coffee beans have passports. I like the calm morning ritual. I like supporting local businesses. I even tolerate oat milk as a concept. What I do not tolerate is a drink being handed to me with emotional interference. This happened Tuesday morning at a small downtown cafe with one of those pun names. Bean There. Cute name.
Too cute, honestly. But Dan said their pastries were actually decent, and that is basically a standing ovation from him before noon.
We were on our way to buy curtain rods, which already meant the morning required stability. Curtain rods are never just curtain rods. They are measurements, brackets, screws, and one person saying, "This should be easy," right before everyone loses faith. I had not had coffee yet. Dan said we should stop somewhere quick. Quick is one of those words people use right before a system reveals itself. There were only 4 people ahead of us. The cafe looked harmless, plants in little pots, soft music. A pastry case trying very hard. Behind the counter, the barista had one of those calm faces people have when they think being unbothered is a personality. I ordered a medium vanilla latte, simple, classic. No drama. The barista said, "Name?" I said Carin. She paused for half a second. And before anyone says pauses mean nothing, pauses are where tone hides. Then she typed something into the screen and said, "That'll be $5.80 I paid." I stepped aside. I was calm. I was normal. I was participating in society before caffeine, which should count as a community service. If you appreciate people asking reasonable questions before coffee, subscribe, because apparently the modern cafe experience now requires silent acceptance with foam. While we waited, Dan looked into the pastry case and said, "Do you want to split a croissant?" I said, "I want to see how the latte comes out first." He looked confused. "Why would that affect the croissant?" I said. "Because service has a temperature." He looked at me the way he looks at complicated parking signs, like the information is there, but he refuses to emotionally engage with it. A few minutes later, the barista called, "Carin?" Not Carin. Carin, like my name, had been softened without permission. I walked up and saw the cup. On the side, written in black marker, was Carin. Now, people will say, maybe she misheard you. Fine, maybe. But if someone hears Carin, pauses, and then writes Carin, that is not just spelling. That is interpretation. I said, "Is this mine?" The barista said, "Vanilla latte?" I said, "Yes, but the name is different." She looked at the cup and said, "Oh, sorry, I respect sorry. Sorry is useful." But this was the kind of sorry people say while already mentally moving on to the next oat milk situation. It did not have roots. I took the cup, and that is when I saw the foam. The foam was uneven. Not artisanal uneven. Not charming cafe uneven. Emotionally uneven. One side had a soft swirl, and the other side had collapsed into a shape that looked almost like a smirk. I stared at it. Dan said, "Please drink it." I said, "I'm assessing it." He said, "It's coffee." I said, "Coffee can communicate." The barista had already turned to another drink, but I could feel that she was aware of me being aware of the cup. There is a certain energy behind a counter when someone hopes you will accept the object and leave with your questions still inside you. I did not leave. I turned the cup slightly. The foam still looked wrong from another angle. "Sometimes a problem follows rotation," I said to Dan. "Does this look normal to you?" He glanced at it for half a second. Yes. Impossible. He had not studied it. He looked at that foam like a man trying not to be selected for jury duty. I said, "You barely looked," he said, "because I want curtain rods." That is marriage. One person is noticing beverage attitude, and the other is still mentally in aisle 7. I walked back toward the counter. Calmly, I said, "Hi, quick question. Was this latte made with attitude? Or is this just the foam?" The cafe got quiet in the way public spaces get quiet when people are pretending not to listen with their entire bodies. The barista blinked, she said, "With attitude?" I said, "Yes. I'm asking whether the final presentation of the drink was neutral." She looked at the cup. I held it up slightly, not dramatically. Just enough for the foam to join the conversation, she said. It's just foam. That is exactly what someone would say if foam had become the delivery method.
Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely want to know when customers stopped being allowed to ask whether their beverage arrived with emotional content.
The man behind me made a small sound. Not a laugh, a sound people hide disrespect inside breath all the time. The barista said, "I can remake it if you want." Now, that sounded polite, but wording matters. If you want, as if I had invented the issue, as if the cup did not say Carin, as if the foam had not arrived looking like it knew something about me. I said, "I don't want to waste product. I just want to understand what happened." Dan appeared beside me and said, "Nothing happened." I said, "Dan, the cup says Carin." The barista said, "I'm sorry about the name." I said, "Thank you." "And the foam?" She paused again. Second pause. I did not say anything for a second because sometimes you have to let a pause introduce itself. She said, "Foam just settles." I said, "Does it normally settle with expression?" Dan whispered, "Carin?" I said, "Do not use my correct name only when trying to stop me." A woman near the pickup counter looked down into her own drink immediately, which proved my point. Once one person notices, everyone starts checking their foam. That is how public awareness begins. Then the barista asked, "Do you want a lid?" A lid. Interesting, because a lid would conceal the issue. A lid would make the whole situation private. I'm not accusing anyone of a cover-up. I'm simply saying the lid arrived at a very convenient moment. I said, "No, thank you. I prefer transparency." Dan closed his eyes at that point. The manager came over. I did not request him. He simply appeared, the way managers appear when the air around a counter becomes too specific. He said, "Everything okay over here?" I said, "That depends. Do your drinks have a standard emotional neutrality policy?" The manager looked at the barista. The barista looked at the espresso machine. The espresso machine, frankly, looked smug. He said, "I'm not sure what you mean." I said, "I ordered a vanilla latte. My name was altered." The foam collapsed into a shape with visible attitude. "I'm asking whether this was accidental, artistic, or commentary." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We definitely don't put commentary in drinks." Good. That was helpful. But then he smiled. Not a warm smile, not a guilty smile, a small customer service smile. The kind that says, "I am using the correct face while waiting for this to end." I said, "I appreciate that, but the customer experience includes product, presentation, and tone." He said, "Of course," I said. "So we agree tone matters," he said. "In the exchange?" I said, "Exactly." A person at a nearby table coughed directly into a napkin. Apparently the cafe had a sudden outbreak of throat events. If you think names on cups should be spelled with emotional accuracy, hit the like button, because this is how small standards disappear. The manager offered to remake the latte. This was the second remake offer, which made me feel they were trying to move me out of the evidence stage and into the replacement stage. I said, "If you remake it, will it be made neutrally?" The barista said, "Yes, too fast." Dan said, "Great, thank you." I said, "Dan, you do not accept neutrality on behalf of the household." He said, "It's a latte." I said, "It is currently a case study." They remade the drink. While I waited, I watched the process. Not hovering, observing from a reasonable customer location. The barista pulled the espresso, steamed the milk, poured it, and placed the cup on the counter. This time the cup said Carin, correct? The foam was smooth, very smooth, suspiciously smooth, almost too neutral, like it had been coached. The barista said, "Here you go." I said, "Thank you. This is much better." She said, "Great," and there was still a tone in the great. But I chose not to reopen the file. That is called growth, and it is rarely acknowledged in real time. I took a sip. The latte was good. That complicated things. I am fair enough to admit when a beverage is technically competent. Dan said, "Can we go now?" I said, "Yes." Then I turned back and said, "Just one small suggestion." Dan's shoulders fell like a stage curtain. I said to the manager, "It may help to remind staff that when a customer asks about presentation, they are not always complaining. Sometimes they are pointing out that the product arrived with a message." The manager nodded slowly. That nod contained nothing. I have seen richer nods from decorative pumpkins. He said, "We'll keep that in mind," which means absolutely never. Outside, Dan said, "You asked if coffee had feelings." I said, "No, I asked if it had attitude." "Feelings and attitude are different categories," he said. "You held up foam in public." I said, "Because the public was already involved?" He said, "How?" I said, "They were in the line." Dan got into the car and stared forward for several seconds before starting it. On the way to the hardware store, I looked at the cup again. Correct name, smooth foam, better temperature. That means the system was capable of improvement, which means the original experience was not inevitable. People do not like when you prove preventability. Later that day, I posted in the neighborhood chat, question, if a coffee shop spells your name wrong and the drink presentation feels pointed, would you ask for clarification or simply accept the cup? Brian replied, "What does pointed coffee mean?" Rebecca wrote, "Please tell me Dan got a pastry." I wrote, "Dan abandoned the croissant discussion under pressure." Marcy sent a photo of her dog with a tiny foam mustache. I do not know where she gets these things anymore. At this point, I think the dog has a brand team. Brian wrote, "Was the coffee actually bad?" I wrote, "That is not the only measurement." Rebecca wrote, "Oh no, it had a tone." Exactly. The next morning I considered leaving a review. I did not. That shows restraint. But I did draft one in my notes app titled Good Latte, Unclear Beverage Attitude. I may never post it. Sometimes documentation is just where truth goes to sit down. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next time I will explain why the woman at the hardware store told me aisle 7 like I should have already known. As for the café, I stand by my question. I did not attack the barista. I did not insult the latte. I did not demand a free pastry, though honestly, after the name incident, a small croissant gesture would not have been excessive. I asked whether my coffee had an attitude, and after the remake, the name was correct and the foam behaved, so everyone can laugh. Everyone can say I overreacted. Everyone can pretend they have never looked at a drink, an email, a receipt, or a punctuation mark, and thought, that felt personal. But the second latte was better. The cup said Carin. The foam stopped smirking. And if people want to enjoy the benefits of corrected service while mocking the person brave enough to identify tone and dairy, that is between them and their next passive-aggressive cappuccino, my side of the story, obviously.